during the Tokugawa shogunate, a highly skilled swordsman appeared. This man single-handedly wiped out an entire group of shogunate soldiers without suffering a single wound. His name was Badosai. Fast forward to the present, we meet our protagonist, a wandering swordsman. While traveling on the road, he is mistaken by a girl for Badosai, the notorious assassin everyone has heard about, and she attacks him. However, she quickly realizes that he is not the feared Badosai, but still, he carries an unusual sword, a reverse blade sword, which has its edge inward, making it almost useless. She informs him that the use of swords is prohibited in the area. She then hears nearby police officers in combat and rushes over, thinking they've caught the real Badosai. Upon arrival, she sees the police fighting a large man who has already killed several officers and is arrogantly claiming to be Badosai. The girl attempts to join the battle but is wounded on the arm, forcing the protagonist to step in and assist her. As more police arrive, the man retreats. The girl wants to pursue him, but the protagonist stops her, warning that she could end up dead if she insists on chasing someone while injured. She argues that the man is using her school's name to kill, and she must stop him. The protagonist helps her leave before the police arrive. They go back to her dojo, where she introduces herself as Kaoru. She explains that her school, though small, once had a reputation. However, months ago, a killer emerged, and now many of her students have fled in fear. Even though Badosai's name has been feared for a long time, people are still terrified of it. She is uncertain if the man they faced was really Badosai, but she knows she must stop him. The protagonist advises her not to go out at night, as it is dangerous, and that her school's honor is not worth her life. Kaoru retorts that her father founded the school to use the sword for saving lives, but a year ago, he was called to the battlefield and died. Now, someone is misusing the school's name to commit evil, and she must stop him. She adds that someone like him, a wanderer without ideals, wouldn't understand. The protagonist leaves, warning Kaoru again not to go out at night. He reminds her that protecting the school comes second to preserving her life, as her father would not want her to die for his honor. Kaoru's uncle, who has no ideals himself, advises her not to listen to the protagonist, as wanderers rarely value such things. A few days later, while Kaoru is out, she sees the protagonist being detained by the police for carrying a sword in public. Kaoru's uncle bribes the police to have him released. The protagonist thanks both of them and asks about the murderer. Kaoru says she hasn't made any progress but heard that there was once a dojo in a neighboring town, now overrun by criminals. A few months ago, a samurai who had fallen from grace took charge of the place. He is over 2 meters tall and resembles the murderer. Kaoru's uncle leaves, and Kaoru invites the protagonist to stay the night. He declines, citing personal matters. He then asks about her uncle, and Kaoru explains that she found him unconscious in front of her house months ago and took him in as a servant. She didn't inquire about his past to respect his privacy. Later that night, the protagonist heads to the criminal-occupied dojo in the neighboring town to find the murderer, knowing he is impersonating Badosai. His hunch is correct. His arrival causes the criminals inside to take notice and attempt to overwhelm him, as they see him as just a skinny man. Meanwhile, Kaoru's uncle pressures her to sell her land and dojo, claiming the land's price is rising. She refuses, but he forces her to comply. It turns out he is the leader of the 2-meter-tall murderer and has come to take control of her property. Her wooden sword couldn't match the strength of the opponent, so the old servant quickly drew some of her blood and used it to sign the transfer deed. At that moment, the wanderer arrived. He swiftly dealt with the group of thugs and did not speak flowery words about swordsmanship like Kaoru. To him, a sword was a weapon, and swordsmanship was a technique for killing. What Kaoru thought of swordsmanship was the naive idea of someone who had not experienced the world. She was still too innocent, but he liked her innocence. He then rushed in to handle the thugs of the 2 villains. One slash from him was enough to take down 4 or 5 men at once. He explained that the true swordsmanship of Batosai was a technique from the Warring States period, and if he wasn't using the reverse blade sword, they would all be dead by now. Everyone realized that he was truly Batosai. However, the 2-meter-tall man remained unafraid and drew his sword to fight. The protagonist realized that he had made a mistake by not dealing with him the first time they met. Just as the man was about to strike, the protagonist jumped out of his line of sight and slashed him in the head. Only the leader remained, and after a few threats, he was so terrified that he passed out. The protagonist didn't intentionally hide the fact that he was Batosai from Kaoru. He just no longer wished to bring it up. He was about to leave when Kaoru called out to him, asking him to stay. He replied that if she allowed Batosai to stay in her dojo, it would be like destroying it. But Kaoru didn't need Batosai. She needed him, the wanderer she had met. She knew that Batosai was just a title he had used when he was a swordsman. He then told her his name was Kenshin, and, after having wandered for so long, he was a bit tired and would stay for a while. A week passed, and the issue with the murderer was resolved, but no students had returned to the dojo. Kaoru was also puzzled as to why Kenshin, who was 28, still looked so youthful. The two of them went out as Kaoru wanted to visit a friend's dojo to practice. Kenshin believed her students would return soon. Suddenly, a young boy snatched Kenshin's wallet. Kaoru realized this and caught the boy to retrieve it, but Kenshin, being kind-hearted, just gave it to him. The boy threw the wallet back at Kenshin, introducing himself as Yahiko, a descendant of samurai, and stating he didn't need Kenshin's pity. He only wanted to tease Kenshin because he saw him carrying a sword in public. Kenshin noticed that despite Yahiko being a child, his mind was mature, so he apologized for underestimating him. They continued walking, and Kenshin remarked on how lively the area was. Kaoru wanted to ask why Kenshin had become a wanderer, but remembering her desire to respect others' privacy, she refrained. As they parted ways, Kaoru asked Kenshin to buy something for her. He walked away leisurely, only to bump into a man on a carriage. The man stopped to ask for directions to the police station. After Kaoru gave him the directions, she wondered who this man was, as he clearly held a high position. Meanwhile, Yahiko was being threatened by 2 thugs demanding protection money. Yahiko told them he would give it to them at night, but they beat him up and threatened that if he didn't pay by night, he would be done for. Kaoru then heard that the police were chasing a man with a sword. Realizing that Kenshin was in trouble, she ran to find him. By the time she arrived, Kenshin was cornered when several police officers with swords appeared. They were considered elite enforcers in Tokyo, and regular officers couldn't do anything to stop them. The lieutenant wanted to force Kenshin to draw his sword so he would have a reason to fight. When a regular officer spoke up, the lieutenant struck him. Kenshin didn't want to draw his sword recklessly because he carried it not to show off. Just then, Kaoru arrived. The lieutenant had her restrained and threatened to disgrace her if Kenshin didn't draw his sword. The people watching thought they were a group of tyrants, but the lieutenant threatened them, saying that anyone who opposed him would be executed for obstructing law enforcement. Kenshin had no choice but to draw his sword. At that moment, the uncle who had asked Kaoru for directions earlier was with the police chief. He had come to find Batosai, explaining that Batosai had been misunderstood by the public. It was true that Batosai had killed, but not for personal gain. He had killed to serve the revolution. The uncle wanted to find Batosai and bring him to meet with the high-ranking government leaders. Suddenly, a police officer burst in with news that the police swordsmen were causing trouble. The chief informed the uncle about the police swordsman unit, established to enforce the law. The lieutenant was once from a family that played a role in the revolution. These families, called the Kishishi, were divided into 5 major groups based on their origins. The 2 most powerful groups were Satsuma and Chaoshu, who had significant power during the Meiji Restoration. Today, Satsuma held power in the police, while Chaoshu controlled the military. The chief asked what the lieutenant had caused trouble with. and all he heard was that the lieutenant and his swordsman had been defeated by a rather short man with red hair, fast movements, and a cross-shaped scar on his cheek. Hearing this, the official was shocked. They then went to the scene and found only 3 swordsmen left facing Kenshin. He easily dealt with 2 of them, leaving only the lieutenant. He gave the lieutenant a chance to swear to the people that he would no longer oppress them, and he would go to the station with him. But the lieutenant refused and charged at Kenshin, only to be swiftly defeated with a slash to the back. The people gathered around, celebrating Kenshin's victory, but he noticed the official approaching. Kaoru recognized the man from his name. He was the former commander of the most powerful Kashishi group during the revolution and now a marshal in the government army. He invited Kenshin to work for the government, but Kenshin refused. He didn't want to use his actions as a killer to justify accepting a position. The official believed that Kenshin's actions were for justice, but Kenshin explained that he didn't carry a sword to seek a high position. He carried it to protect his country. Afterward, Kenshin and Kaoru left, and Kenshin reflected that he had gone from being an assassin to a wanderer. He now only used the sword to protect those he cared about. The police chief realized that the Badosai they had heard about wasn't a cold-blooded killer, but actually a kind person. Kaoru now understood why Kenshin chose to be a wanderer. He just wanted freedom. Meanwhile, Yahiko, the boy, had found the role model he wanted to follow Kenshin. Later, Yahiko saw an old woman drop her wallet. Faced with the selfish choice of either handing the money to 2 thugs to avoid being beaten or doing the right thing, Yahiko chose to return the wallet to the old woman. That afternoon, the 2 thugs found Yahiko and demanded protection money. Yahiko had decided to leave his pickpocketing ways behind, but one thug beat him up, asking what his decision was. Yahiko responded that this life was shameful. The thug decided to teach him a lesson, but just then, Kaoru arrived with some goods and saw the thugs dragging Yahiko away. The thugs took him back to their hideout, where the leader, a former samurai, declared that in the current era, samurai were useless. They had lost their power and were nothing more than destitute, with only money and power left to be valued. He mentioned how many of the bandits had once been samurai. Despite this, Yahiko rejected the thug's way of life and was beaten for it. The leader then mocked Yahiko's family, saying that his father had fought the government and died, while his mother had worked in a brothel and died from illness. Yahiko stood up, declaring that his father had sacrificed himself for the greater good by joining the Revolutionary Army, and his mother had worked hard and died from that labor. He would not allow anyone to slander his family. The thug, still holding a sword, was about to strike Yahiko when Kenshin suddenly burst in, demanding Yahiko's release. The thug attempted to fight Kenshin, but he was swiftly knocked out when Kenshin struck him against the ceiling. The gang leader, realizing his situation, began to fear Kenshin. He allowed Kenshin to take Yahiko with him, and Kenshin apologized for underestimating the boy, promising to treat his injuries as a way to make up for it. The gang members were dissatisfied, but the leader told them to let Kenshin go. He recognized the deadly gaze in Kenshin's eyes, realizing that even if they fought him, they wouldn't win. It was better to lose one brat and live in peace. Kenshin then took Yahiko to Kaoru's dojo, telling him that Yahiko would be her pupil from now on. Both of them were reluctant. Yahiko still called Kaoru ugly, and Kaoru didn't know how to be patient with kids. However, both reluctantly agreed to try training the next morning out of respect for Kenshin. The next morning, when Kaoru handed Yahiko a wooden sword for practice, Yahiko threw it aside, refusing to follow Kaoru's orders. Kenshin advised Kaoru to value her only student, but just then, several people had gathered to learn, drawn by admiration for Kenshin. Since Kenshin wasn't teaching them, he sent them away, which annoyed Kaoru because if he hadn't chased them off, she would have had more students to teach. Kenshin explained that they weren't interested in learning and wouldn't last, so it was better to focus on Yahiko, who had motivation. Yahiko, however, stated that he preferred Kenshin's swordsmanship to Kaoru's. Kenshin made it clear that he had no intention of passing on his sword skills to others, but the two continued to argue. After a while, Kaoru lost track of Yahiko, and when she found him, he threw a slipper at her, complaining that he'd rather learn on his own than be taught by her. He also remarked that she was so strict that no students had returned since the first day. Just then, 2 of Kaoru's former students arrived, being chased by 2 thugs. Kaoru stepped in and defeated both thugs. The students explained that they had encountered a group of drunkards causing trouble and had tried to help, only to be chased by their comrades. The rest of the gang soon arrived, forcing them to hide in the dojo. Kaoru recognized them as members of a notorious gang, and with Kenshin out, they had no one to deal with them. Yahiko, who had caught the scent of alcohol on Kaoru's students, accused them of starting the trouble. The 2 students apologized, but the gang pulled out fireworks, determined to destroy the dojo's walls. They wanted revenge for the broken arm of one of their members. Kaoru and Yahiko were both furious at the students for learning swordsmanship only to cause trouble in the streets. Yahiko suggested they take the 2 students away to punish them, but the thugs insisted on taking them both for covering up. Kaoru decided to take full responsibility, as she was the one who had taught them to use swords. Just then, Kenshin returned. The gang recognized him and tried to retreat, but the leader, confident with his fireworks, insisted on fighting. Kenshin calmly slashed the firework, cutting it in half, and the gang leader froze, realizing that they were no match for Kenshin and decided to leave. After hearing the whole story, Kenshin let Kaoru's 2 students go, advising them to forget they had ever been her pupils and to never pick up a sword again. The 2 students left, and the 3 main characters returned inside to clean up the dojo. Yahiko then decided to officially accept Kaoru as his master. He knew he couldn't catch up with Kenshin, but he would at least try to match Kaoru. A few days later, Yahiko practiced swinging his sword diligently, but Kenshin, who was cutting wood with his sword, made Yahiko frustrated. Kenshin used swordsmanship for everyday tasks, but refused to teach others. At that moment, Kaoru ran out, excited to tell them that she had found a valuable painting left by her grandfather. If sold, it would provide them with money for their living expenses. Kaoru decided to treat them to a beef hot pot, which had recently become a popular dish imported from abroad. When they went to the restaurant, they saw 3 older men sitting and eating hot pot, drinking sake, and discussing grand matters like democracy and equality. The argument between the 3 escalated to the point where they threw a bottle of alcohol at Kenshin's head, causing Yahiko to get angry and curse at them, demanding an apology. They refused to apologize and started arguing back with Yahiko, even getting physical with the tavern staff. A young man stepped in to resolve the situation, saying that the 3 men, who were talking about civil rights, were no different from thugs because they resorted to violence. The group then decided to take the fight outside. The young man in white allowed the other side to strike first, and they immediately pulled out hidden weapons and attacked his head. However, his head remained unscathed, while the arm of the attacker was struck by the weapon. The young man in white then decided to fight with only one hand, which made the attacker feel disrespected and charge again, only to be knocked to the ground with a single blow. One person tried to draw his sword, but Kenshin warned him that if he did so, he would not hesitate to fight back. Kenshin advised them to first temper their egos before discussing matters of the people. The 3 men then withdrew, and the young man in white realized Kenshin was very strong and wanted to spar with him, as he had noticed Kenshin intentionally taking hits to prevent the bottle from hitting Kaoru. However, Kenshin refused to duel, and the young man left his address in case Kenshin changed his mind. As he left, the group noticed the word evil written on his back, making them unsure if he was good or bad. That night, the young man returned home, and it was revealed that his name was Zazen, a troublemaker seeking a worthy opponent. 2 men who had once tried to steal Kaoru's dojo had escaped prison and sought Zazen's help to deal with Kenshin, the legendary Batusai, believing he would be a worthy match for Zazen. A few weeks later, Zazen still had no news of Kenshin, but he continued his usual troublemaking. However, today he decided to meet Kenshin directly. Upon meeting Kenshin, Zazen openly said he knew about Kenshin's past as the Batusai and a key figure in the Revolutionary Army. He had achieved numerous victories for the army, but now lived as a wanderer. Since he had only gathered this much information, he came to spar with Kenshin to learn more about his swordsmanship. Meanwhile, two dishonorable men were waiting outside, hoping to ambush Kenshin, knowing that Zazen was capable of seriously injuring him, and when that happened, they would use a gun to finish him off. Kenshin then wondered why Zazen, who liked to protect the weak, would seek to cause trouble, especially with the word evil on his back. Zazen's reasoning had become seriously warped. He believed that those like Kenshin, who called themselves revolutionaries, were arrogant, using justice as an excuse to do whatever they wanted and eliminate anyone in their way. Among these revolutionaries, Kenshin was the strongest, which is why Zazen wanted to fight him. Kenshin agreed to spar, but before starting, he asked Zazen if the two men who had told him about Kenshin were the same ones he had defeated earlier. Zazen confirmed this, so Kenshin called them out, having sensed their murderous intent outside. Zazen also called them out, forcing them to reveal themselves. Zazen then took the gun, smashed it, and told them not to interfere with the duel. The group decided to move to the riverbank to fight more freely. Along the way, everyone noticed them, and Yahiko, unsure of what Zazen was carrying, thought it resembled a spear or a halberd. However, Zazen revealed it was something much more interesting, a horse-chopping sword, a type of blade designed to cut through both enemy generals and horses. It was created during wartime, but no one had mastered it due to its weight. Though Zazen couldn't wield it perfectly, he was strong enough to use it to overwhelm his opponents. Zazen charged forward, but Kenshin quickly moved behind him and delivered a blow that sent Zazen flying. Everyone thought Kenshin had finished him in one strike, but Zazen proved to be much tougher than that. Kaoru realized that Kenshin was now at a disadvantage, as his swordsmanship was meant to end a fight in a single blow. Zazen wants to engage in a battle of endurance with Kenshin, where only the one who lasts the longest will be declared the winner. However, Kenshin also wants to see if Zazen can withstand all of his strikes. Everyone believes that Zazen has no chance because he won't be able to land a single hit on Kenshin. Kenshin advises Zazen to give up, but Zazen doesn't like ending a fight halfway. Therefore, round 2 begins. Zazen charges forward, launching a series of relentless attacks, but Kenshin dodges all of them, jumping behind and stepping on Zazen's sword to close the distance and strike. Kenshin then starts to counterattack aggressively, injuring Zazen quite a bit. Kenshin explains that because Zazen's sword is so large and heavy, his attacks are easily predictable. Zazen didn't expect that Kenshin's skills and experience would be so superior. Zazen still wants to continue the fight, but Kenshin refuses as he no longer wants to point his sword at Zazen. At this point, Zazen starts remembering his past. He had once been part of a group of revolutionaries led by a captain he greatly admired. The people loved Zazen and his group because they represented the people's justice. The captain had shown Zazen that the peaceful sight of villages cooking and living together was the ideal world they wanted to create. However, after a while, they learned that other factions were impersonating the government military for personal gain, which made the people lose trust in them. The new government then stopped supporting them, and the money they had been using to support their troops started running out. The captain of Zazen's group decided to go to the headquarters to discuss matters, and Zazen and a friend were told to stay behind because the trip would be dangerous. After some time, Zazen's friend returned with the news that their captain had been executed. The new government accused the captain of impersonating the army and spreading false rumors about reducing taxes. This memory drove Zazen to rise again, believing that both the revolutionaries and the new government were responsible for his group's downfall. When Zazen mentions the name of his old group, Kenshin realizes who they were. However, Kenshin continues to dodge Zazen's attacks, allowing him to fall on his own. At this moment, an old servant pulls out a gun and shoots at Kenshin, believing he won't be able to predict this attack. But Kenshin uses his sword to block the bullet and stands up. The servant then orders his younger brother to capture Kaoru and Yahiko in an attempt to threaten Kenshin. However, Zazen throws his sword toward them, warning them not to interfere. Kenshin then delivers several blows to the servant, making him experience pain like never before. Kenshin then decides to finish the fight with Zazen. He rushes at Zazen and delivers a strike that shatters his sword, then follows up with a powerful blow to Zazen's head. Despite this, Zazen remains standing, so Kenshin decides to go get a doctor. Zazen insists he hasn't lost and refuses to be defeated by a revolutionary like Kenshin. He harbors a deep hatred for the revolutionaries and the new government, who he believes caused his captain's death. Kenshin asks if his captain ever taught him how to fight against a revolutionary, but Zazen refuses to learn from Kenshin. Kaoru intervenes and explains that Kenshin is different from other revolutionaries because he fights without seeking fame or power. Kenshin's only goal is to continue helping people and to change the world, knowing that even though the revolution is over, the issue of class inequality still exists. Zazen realizes that Kenshin is very similar to his former captain. Zazen, who has given up on trying to change things, now seeks destruction, while Kenshin continues to hold on to his ideals. Zazen understands that he has been completely defeated and collapses. After receiving treatment, Zazen is severely injured and will take months to recover. Kenshin did what he had to, as Zazen's strength far exceeded that of the thugs Kenshin usually dealt with. The group was planning to go eat beef hot pot when they unexpectedly ran into Zazen. He had recovered enough to move again, though striking his weak points would still easily incapacitate him. Zazen decided that from now on, he would change himself and follow Kenshin to monitor if Kenshin truly was a revolutionary who helped people, as he claimed. Zazen also announced that he would abandon the name Zazen and revert to his real name, Sano. Suddenly, the waitress from the hot pot restaurant came out, complaining that Sano had skipped out on paying again. In the following days, Sano began freeloading at Kaoru's dojo since he had stopped causing trouble and was now unemployed. He criticized Kaoru's cooking for being unappetizing, leading her to throw a bucket at him, which he used Kenshin to shield himself from. One day, the police chief visited Kenshin to request his help. The chief told him about a man named Kurosaga, an assassin who recently started targeting former revolutionaries working in the current government. Kurosaga always sent a warning letter to his targets before striking and had never failed in the past 10 years. What worried the chief most was Kurosaga's bloodthirsty nature. He enjoyed killing. His warning letters were meant to provoke his targets into gathering as many guards as possible, allowing him to revel in the slaughter. 2 months ago, Kurosaga assassinated a target, leaving behind 36 dead bodies and 54 injured. Survivors reported that they were struck down before they could even draw their guns, describing a sensation of being paralyzed, like being crushed by an invisible force, which rendered them helpless. Kenshin deduced that Kurosaga had a secret technique and agreed to help. This time, the target was a former revolutionary who had survived countless battles during the revolution. The man dismissed Kurosaga, believing he could not be harmed due to his support from a team of skilled swordsmen. However, when the police chief brought Kenshin to meet him, the official showed visible fear, as Kenshin had saved him numerous times during the revolution. The swordsmen, too, refrained from posturing, as they had previously been beaten by Sano. Sano decided to put aside past grudges to cooperate for the night. After setting up their defensive positions, Sano and Kenshin played chess while waiting for Kurosaga to arrive. Sano asked Kenshin about Kurosaga's technique, but before Kenshin could explain, commotion erupted outside. A few policemen had been taken down. They immediately prepared to intercept Kurosaga at the front entrance, but he appeared instead at the rear window, swiftly killing one guard. True to his warning letter, Kurosaga had come for his target. The official ordered his hired swordsmen to fight, promising 5 times their pay. Greedy for the reward, they recklessly charged without regard for their lives, only to fall victim to Kurosaga's special technique, which immobilized them all. Sono, however, was still able to move, though his body felt incredibly heavy. Kenshin then stepped in to face Kurosaga, recognizing who he truly was. Kurosaga was an infamous assassin from the Warring States period, unaffiliated with any faction, responsible for numerous assassinations. Kurosaga, in turn, identified Kenshin as the legendary revolutionary assassin Badosai. He began using his immobilization technique on Kenshin, but Kenshin broke free of it, realizing it was similar to Conqueror's Haki, which only worked on those weaker than the user. Against an equal opponent, the technique was ineffective. Kurosaga then decided to eliminate his primary target before confronting Kenshin. However, Sano charged forward, breaking Kurosaga's sword and willingly taking a stab wound to his arm to protect the official. Realizing he couldn't win this encounter, Kurosaga retreated, declaring that Kenshin would be his next target. He expressed a desire for Kenshin to use a proper sword, not his reverse blade, in their duel. By shifting his focus to Kenshin, Kurosaga inadvertently eased Kenshin's worries, as Kenshin felt confident in handling the assassin himself. Sano and Kenshin returned home, marking this as one of Kurosaga's assassination attempts with the fewest casualties. Kenshin later explained Kurosaga's technique to Sano. The immobilization ability was Kurosaga's unique invention, and only he could use it. Others, including Kenshin and Sano, couldn't learn it. Kenshin described the technique as a method of applying immense pressure to mentally overwhelm and paralyze weaker opponents. Kenshin now finds himself uncertain whether he can defeat Kurosaga. Both are assassins, but while Kenshin has laid down his sword, Kurosaga remains bloodthirsty. According to Kenshin's knowledge, Kurosaga was once a retainer of the shogunate, but after being disciplined, he killed his comrades and defected to the Patriots' side. His only desire is senseless killing. Now that Kurosaga has targeted Kenshin, Kenshin intends to face him alone and requests Sano's assistance. The following morning, Sano returns to Kaoru's dojo to inform her that Kenshin won't be coming back for the time being to ensure her safety. However, Kaoru runs off to find Kenshin, afraid he might leave for good after defeating Kurosaga. Sano and Yahiko suspect that Kaoru has developed feelings for Kenshin and cannot bear to part with him. She eventually finds Kenshin by the river and expresses her fear of his departure. Kenshin reassures her that if Kurosaga appears, he wouldn't be able to protect her while fighting him. Kaoru then lends Kenshin her hair ribbon as a keepsake, demanding that he return it once the battle is over. Moments later, Kurosaga approaches by boat and suddenly snatches Kaoru right before Kenshin's eyes. Kurosaga reveals that his true intention in abducting Kaoru is not to weaken Kenshin, but to provoke him into reverting to his former cold-blooded Badosai persona, a legendary swordsman whose skills Kurosaga both fears and envies. That evening, Kurosaga waits for Kenshin at the appointed meeting place, explaining to Kaoru that he intends to unleash the terrifying Badosai who once annihilated an entire unit of shogunate soldiers in an instant. Kurosaga was among the survivors spared by Kenshin that day. Back then, he realized he stood no chance against Kenshin, but now, as a demon-like assassin himself, he believes he can finally surpass Kenshin. When Kenshin arrives, Kaoru notices his demeanor and gaze have changed completely. Holding his reverse blade sword, Kenshin appears ready to unleash the killer he once was. The battle begins with a rapid exchange of blows, their swords clashing intensely. Kenshin quickly deciphers Kurosaga's movements and uses his sword's hilt to disarm him. But Kurosaga deftly switches his weapon to his other hand and lands a stab on Kenshin. Mocking Kenshin for his naivety, Kurosaga claims that he's unmatched in adaptability. To further enrage Kenshin, Kurosaga uses his technique on Kaoru, paralyzing her lungs and leaving her with only 2 minutes before she suffocates. Furious, Kenshin delivers a devastating blow to Kurosaga's face, unleashing the full might of the Badosai persona. Kurosaga immediately senses Kenshin's murderous intent and retreats in fear. Kenshin gives him 2 options: remove the curse on Kaoru or die. However, Kurosaga opts for a deathmatch, knowing the curse will lift upon his death. To maximize his power, Kurosaga uses his technique on himself, amplifying his strength to the point of easily shattering boulders, a move he hasn't used in 15 years. Undeterred, Kenshin assumes a stance with his sword sheathed. Kurosaga recognizes this as a batojutsu technique, where the sword is drawn with blinding speed for a one-hit kill. However, the technique is a double-edged sword. If Kenshin misses, he himself will be vulnerable. Confident in his agility, Kurosaga charges, believing Kenshin's reverse blade sword would make it difficult to execute the technique properly. At the last moment, Kurosaga hesitates and dodges the strike, but Kenshin uses the sheath to smash Kurosaga's elbow, crippling his dominant hand and ending his career as a swordsman. Even so, Kenshin prepares to deliver the killing blow, and Kurosaga accepts his fate, ready to face death at the hands of the legendary Badosai. At that moment, Kaoru broke the spell herself to stop Kenshin. He snapped out of it and rushed to catch her. The Badosai persona within him vanished, returning him to his usual self. However, Kurosaga suddenly rushed toward Kenshin from behind. Kenshin believed that Kurosaga had already lost because his left hand and the small sword he was holding were insufficient for victory. Yet, just as Kenshin was about to swing his sword to block Kurosaga's attack, the latter stabbed himself in the chest instead. Kurosaga refused to be captured, as being interrogated would reveal the former loyalist who had hired him. He remarked that in this era, people like him and Kenshin still had a place. The current government was no different from the shogunate of the past, secretly vying for power. Today, the streets were filled with police, leaving killers like him with no place in society, forcing them to operate in the shadows. Corrupt officials needed someone to do their dirty work, and so the two sides collaborated. Now that his sword arm was crippled, Kurosaga felt there was no reason to continue living. A killer, after all, remained a killer until death. He declared that he would watch from the afterlife to see how long Kenshin could continue being a wanderer. Upon returning, Kenshin gave Kaoru back her ribbon, but it was stained with blood from his earlier wounds. He told Kurosaga to watch from the afterlife, as he would strive to suppress the killer within him and never become Badosai again. A few days later, Kaoru woke up in the morning to find Kenshin missing. When she asked Yahiko, she learned that Kenshin had gone out with Sano to gamble. At that moment, Kenshin and Sano were indeed playing dice with Sano's friends. Although gambling was illegal, they were only playing for fun, not breaking any serious laws. Sano brought Kenshin along because of his ability to hear and predict the dice results. During the game, Sano asked about a mutual friend who loved gambling, only to learn that he had died from an opium overdose. However, opium was expensive in this era, and Sano wondered where their friend had gotten so much money. Suddenly, a young woman burst in, begging Kenshin to save her. She was being chased by two soldiers who entered moments later. Sano dealt with them, and they revealed that they were soldiers under Takeda's command, warning that Sano and Kenshin would pay for interfering. Sano explained to Kenshin that Takeda was a young businessman from out of town who had mysteriously grown wealthy in recent years and had his own private army. Both criminals and politicians avoided provoking him. When asked if she was connected to Takeda, the woman, who introduced herself as Megumi, denied any association. But another assassin appeared, identifying her by name and taunting her that Takeda's men were always watching her, so escape was futile. Despite her defiance, the assassin started firing iron pellets at her, forcing Kenshin to use a rug as a shield, reinforced with his sword scabbard. Though Kenshin didn't fully understand the situation, he refused to stand idly by in the face of evil. Kenshin and Sano quickly subdued the assassin. Realizing their strength, Megumi pleaded with them to act as her bodyguards, promising to pay them. However, Sano insisted she first explain her circumstances. Suddenly, several packets of opium fell from her belongings, prompting Kenshin to demand the full truth. Meanwhile, Kaoru, back at the dojo, wondered why the two had not returned yet. Moments later, Kenshin and Sano showed up with Megumi. Sano jokingly told Kaoru that Megumi was something they had won, But Kaoru scolded them, accusing them of human trafficking, and allowed Megumi to leave. However, Megumi refused, claiming she wanted to stay near Kenshin. Kaoru, displeased, threw all three of them out of the dojo. Still unable to get answers from Megumi, Kenshin and Sano decided to follow her and gradually uncover the truth. At that moment, one of Sano's friends rushed over with news that two of Taketa's subordinates had been killed near the riverside. Kenshin then spotted the iron pellet shooter he had encountered earlier standing on the opposite side of the bridge, along with two other formidable figures. The group discussed whether the man who broke the assassin's nose was a red-haired swordsman with a cross-shaped scar, and the shooter realized Kenshin was standing on the other side of the bridge, looking straight at them. They then called two more people to join the gunner in dealing with Kenshin and to bring Megumi back. It was revealed that the tall man was the leader of the soldiers, and the bespectacled man beside him was none other than Taketa, the businessman. To Taketa, Megumi was his golden goose, so he was determined to reclaim her as soon as possible. Megumi also noticed the two figures on the opposite shore. While the businessman wasn't particularly noteworthy, the tall man was different. He was the leader of a group of ninjas who had been active during the revolution. This leader was a genius ninja who had become the head of the group at the young age of 15. His name was Ayashi. That evening, the three of them returned to Kaoru's house to strategize. Kenshin learned that Taketa's army consisted of more than 60 people. However, Megumi still refused to disclose information about the opium. She worried that Kenshin wouldn't be able to handle the ninjas and Taketa, so she planned to escape amidst the chaos. Sano reassured Kaoru not to worry too much about Kenshin, as his nature was to save those in distress. Sano, on the other hand, admitted he was only involved to avenge his friends, not out of altruism like Kenshin. Kenshin gave Sano a brief overview of Taketa's forces and also promised Kaoru that while trouble was on the horizon, he would protect her. Yahiko expressed his desire to help, but Sano dismissed him, saying he wouldn't be of much use. Suddenly, an intruder attacked from outside, forcing Sano and Kenshin to confront him. The attacker was a large, red-skinned man with only 4 teeth, a member of the ninja group. Sano chose to face him, charging forward to land a punch on his stomach. Unfortunately, this brought him within range of the ninja's attack. The man used his teeth to create sparks and spewed fire at Sano, who narrowly dodged. Kenshin told the attacker to focus on him, as he was the true opponent. When the ninja spewed flames at Kenshin, Kenshin split the fire in two with a precise sword slash. Megumi tried to flee during the commotion, but Kaoru stopped her, urging her to stay and put her faith in Kenshin, as he wasn't an ordinary swordsman. Kenshin skillfully cut through all the flames without singeing a single hair. When the attacker began refueling his oil reserves, Sano took over and charged straight into the fire, landing a punch to the ninja's mouth and pulling out the oil pouch from his body. Now that the ninja could no longer spew fire, he charged confidently at Sano, thinking the latter was injured. However, Sano reminded him that if his hands were unusable, he could still use his legs. With a powerful kick, Sano knocked the ninja to the ground. Nearby, the gunner, who had been hiding, saw his ally defeated and decided to target Megumi. He fired a shot, but Kenshin sensed the killing intent and reacted instantly. To everyone's surprise, Yahiko stepped in and shielded Megumi, taking the bullet. The bullet, however, was laced with poison, causing Yahiko to convulse. Kenshin charged at the gunner, but the latter used a decoy to evade the attack. Another masked man appeared behind Kenshin not to fight, but to retrieve the fallen gunner and the defeated ninja. Kenshin refused to let them leave unless they handed over the gunner or the antidote for Yahiko. The masked man, disinterested in negotiations, blocked Kenshin's attacks with his fists and effortlessly carried both men away. Yahiko was still in critical condition. They considered extracting the poison manually, but Megumi stopped them, claiming she had experience in such matters. After observing Yahiko's symptoms, she identified the poison and instructed Kaoru to fetch a doctor while Sano went to buy ice. Before long, Yahiko stabilized, and the doctor remarked that whoever wrote the prescription must have been highly skilled in Western medicine. Hearing Sano mention that woman, the doctor immediately recognized Megumi as the one who wrote it. He explained that she had been an assistant to a doctor 3 years ago before the doctor was murdered. At that moment, Kenshin, noticing Megumi attempting to leave, stopped her. From their conversation, it became clear that Kenshin had figured out her background and wanted to learn everything. Meanwhile, the doctor shared Megumi's story with Kaoru and Sano, revealing that she came from a renowned family of medical practitioners. This family not only taught medicine to men but also to women and children. Although Megumi's family served the shogun, they still treated common people without discrimination. As a result, they were somewhat looked down upon by samurai families. However, in the field of medicine, they were regarded as an ideal of nobility. Megumi's father realized how remarkable Western medicine was and led the family abroad to study. But they soon returned home and were caught up in the war. Megumi was still a child at the time, left behind, and her entire family perished in the war. Since then, she has lived alone. 5 years ago, she moved here and became an apprentice to a well-known doctor. However, 3 years ago, this doctor was murdered. According to Megumi, the doctor had shady connections with Takeda and had sold opium-making materials to the businessman. Up until 3 years ago, the doctor discovered a way to make a cheaper opium with twice the effectiveness. The doctor wanted to monopolize this drug and refused to give it to the businessman, so the businessman had him killed. Now, Megumi is being targeted because she is the only one who knows how to make this opium. She was forced to produce it for him for 3 years, but decided to escape when she realized the wrongs she had committed. Kenshin advised her to stay here, as, despite carrying the guilt alone, fleeing now would be of no use. Kaoru and the others also decided to let her stay for a while longer. Meanwhile, the masked man returned to report to Ayashi about Kenshin's strength. The 2 men previously sent could no longer be used, and the one who had fought Kenshin needed 3 days to recover from the internal injury Kenshin inflicted. Ayashi then tasked him with investigating Kenshin during those 3 days. The next day, Sano went out on patrol, and Megumi stayed home to bake for Kenshin's group. Although the cake was simple, Kaoru couldn't make it herself. Megumi then decided that she would win Kenshin's affection if Kaoru couldn't do anything for him. Although Megumi was still a bit tactless, she seemed to be brighter than before. When Sano returned, Kenshin invited him to try the cake Megumi made. However, Sano would rather eat something Kaoru cooked than something from a drug dealer's associate. Kenshin told Megumi not to take it personally, explaining that Sano was just frustrated since Takeda's men hadn't shown up for a week, which made him restless. While Megumi was doing laundry, a man delivered a book. When he found no one around, he masked up and ordered Megumi to come with him, threatening to dump mercury in the well if she resisted. She was then taken to meet Takeda, who demanded that she return with him, or he would burn down the entire town. He gave her until midnight to answer, or he would set it ablaze that night. The reason for his threat was that they had discovered Kenshin was the legendary Batusai, the man-killer. If they angered him, they would be in trouble. So, they thought it better to have Megumi leave voluntarily to avoid provoking him. However, Megumi left a letter for Kenshin's group, which made Kenshin realize she was being threatened and had fled. He decided to go save her. Sano refused to help, as a friend of his, who sold candy to children, had died from opium made by Megumi. He didn't want to assist her. But Kenshin explained that he was saving her because he saw in her eyes the longing for a family. He also said Sano was no longer the person he had known. Yahiko then decided to follow Kenshin because Megumi had once saved his life, and he now wanted to repay her. Sano also changed his mind and followed Kenshin, deciding not to think too much, but just to wreak havoc as he always did. The 3 of them soon arrived at Takeda's mansion. Kenshin wanted the other 2 to quickly create a path to the front door before the enemy could send reinforcements. Meanwhile, Megumi decided to kill Takeda and go to hell with him, but just as she managed to cut his hand, Ayashi grabbed the knife from her, and told Teikta to listen to what was happening outside. At this point, the Kenshin group charged in and quickly took down the thugs and swordsmen hired by Teikta. Only the gunmen from the army remained. Kenshin led the charge, dealing with most of them, while Sano threw Yahiko inside and helped him snatch a gun, then knocked the commander unconscious. Sano and Kenshin finished off the rest. Teikta, now realizing Kenshin's strength, attempted to strike a deal to hire him as a bodyguard. However, Kenshin's glare made Ayashi intervene, informing Teikta that Kenshin was not someone motivated by fame or profit. Kenshin was once a righteous man, much like Ayashi, and most such individuals would gladly die for a greater cause, eagerly seeking battle. Teikta then offered Kenshin an hour to make arrangements with Megumi before releasing her. Kenshin turned away, cutting the light pole in his yard and declaring that he would return in 1 hour to find Teikta, so Teikta should prepare himself well. Teikta ordered Ayashi to organize the soldiers carefully, but was told by Ayashi that his men would only follow Ayashi's orders. Ayashi would take Megumi to the highest floor to hold her there, while Teikta was free to sit and count his money or do whatever he pleased, as long as he stayed out of Ayashi's business. Megumi regained consciousness and met Ayashi, who returned her knife to her and informed her that Kenshin had arrived. However, Ayashi was confident that he would not let Kenshin reach her. In an hour, Megumi would either die or endure Teikta's torture. Ayashi, along with his men, was only here to find a battlefield, not interested in Teikta's wealth. He sympathized with Megumi's misfortune and offered her a peaceful exit. Meanwhile, Kenshin encountered the masked man, who introduced himself as Hanya, claiming he would guard the door with his life. Kenshin didn't want to engage in pointless fighting and asked Hanya to step aside, but Hanya refused. They were forced to fight. Hanya charged, landing a blow that sent Kenshin back. Kenshin was lightly injured and informed his two companions that he had tried to predict Hanya's movements, but Hanya's arm was longer than he expected, which caught him off guard. Hanya believed that Kenshin had been affected by his technique from 10 days ago, and if Kenshin couldn't see through it, he would never defeat him. Kenshin then raised his sword defensively. Hanya mocked him, saying it was a mistake for the legendary Batosai to use such a defensive stance. Hanya charged again, and Kenshin quickly saw through his move, evading it and counterattacking. Kenshin now understood Hanya's technique. The stripes on Hanya's arms were an optical illusion that disguised the true length of his limbs, making it difficult for opponents to gauge his reach. Kenshin had suspected something was off with Hanya's outfit and mask, which he realized were part of a disguise, not just for covering expressions. Hanya's mask shattered, revealing a disfigured face. He explained that he had intentionally ruined his face to disguise himself as anyone. He had been one of the lucky children to survive in a very poor village where parents had to kill their children to reduce the number of mouths to feed. After surviving, he had to live in hiding, and he destroyed his face so no one would recognize him. Ayashi had taken him in. Now, he unsheathed a pair of claws and attacked furiously, forcing Kenshin to block them. Kenshin deflected the claws and launched a finishing blow. Kenshin was wounded on one arm, while Hanya's claws shattered, and he collapsed. Kenshin remarked that Hanya should have understood and sympathized with Megumi's past. Instead, he had obstructed Kenshin's efforts to save her, just as Ayashi had saved him. Teikta, meanwhile, approached Megumi to negotiate, wanting to leave with her and start anew, intending to use her medicinal skills to heal people. However, Megumi refused, believing that death was the only way to atone for her sins. Teikta, unwilling to wait for Kenshin to come and take her life, began cursing at Megumi. After treating their wounds, the three of them entered through the door and encountered a new enemy, Shiki, who was carrying a steel ball to attack. Sano blocked him and let Kenshin go ahead. He had no intention of stopping them, as he wanted to leave the prey for his boss. He also knew about Sano's infamous past in the underworld and thought that without his sword, Sano could no longer accomplish anything. But the hands that once held that sword were still here. Yahiko was worried about Sano, but Kenshin knew that if they stayed, Sano wouldn't allow them to intervene, so it was best to go ahead. At this point, Shiki decided to fight Sano unarmed, but he removed the chain from the steel ball, pulled Sano close, and beat him. However, Sano stood up and broke the chain because he didn't like having anything restricting him. Shiki, amused, started wrestling with Sano, but he grabbed him and slammed him into the wall, then headbutted him, causing Sano to feel dizzy. He admitted that Sano was very strong and invited him to join Ayashi's ranks. He said that his whole life had been about fighting and that he had once been a samurai until he was defeated by Ayashi and taken in by him. He believed that one day, Sano would be strong enough to match him. But Sano refused because he believed that ninjas like them only sought the strong to fight. Kenshin, on the other hand, was different. Weak people followed him because they admired him, and his reverse blade sword was a symbol of his choice to protect the weak. Shiki became angry at Sano's attitude and repeatedly headbutted him, but Sano managed to break his hand and then punched Shiki in the head. Sano said that if Shiki had the chance, he should fight Kenshin and learn the truth, just as Sano had. After that, he collapsed from exhaustion. Meanwhile, Kenshin encountered Ayashi and demanded that he reveal the whereabouts of Megumi and Takeda. But Ayashi said that Kenshin would need to use his sword to get an answer from him. Kenshin noticed that Ayashi was using a short sword. As he knew, there was a type of katana that consisted of a long blade and a short blade. The long blade was typically used for attacking, while the short blade was used for defense. Ayashi's sword was short, but he chose to attack with it. However, Ayashi fought both with his sword and with martial arts, which caught Kenshin off guard, causing him to be pushed back. Ayashi said he regretted that the Tokugawa shogunate hadn't trusted him with the responsibility of battle. He explained that the shogunate had cowardly abandoned their soldiers and gone into hiding, only to hand over power to the samurai to survive. If he and the ninja team had been allowed to fight, they would have burned down the samurai's base and secretly dealt with the high-ranking samurai, ensuring the shogunate's victory. But now, that was just a what-if, and it no longer mattered. What Ayashi wanted now was to reclaim the title of the strongest, which he had lost to Kenshin. Kenshin, however, believed that while Ayashi was part of the shogunate, he didn't care about the people and was just a cold-blooded warmonger. He wouldn't allow him to run rampant. Kenshin then attacked, but was unable to penetrate Ayashi's short sword and was pushed back instead. Takeda, at this point, was trying to figure out how to defeat both Kenshin and Ayashi, as they were clearly his biggest threats. Suddenly, a servant came in to report that the thing Takeda needed to experiment with was ready. Kenshin, at this point, believed that he had figured out Ayashi's fighting style. Ayashi didn't believe him and wanted to see how much he understood. Kenshin then gripped his sword's hilt to shorten his range of attack to match Ayashi's. He concluded that Ayashi fought by creating a blind spot between his range and Kenshin's, so he would break that blind spot by lowering his own striking range. However, Ayashi changed his approach. Now, he attacked with erratic speed, alternating between fast and slow strikes. He began moving around Kenshin, creating illusions, and Kenshin started seeing multiple versions of Ayashi. Ayashi then launched a surprise attack, catching Kenshin off guard, landing a blow that knocked him down. Ayashi thought Kenshin was dead, so Yahiko tried to finish him off, but Kenshin stood up, having used his sword's scabbard to absorb some of the damage from the blow. Ayashi acknowledged that Kenshin truly deserved the title of the strongest during the revolution, so now he would do his best to claim it. He then began moving erratically and attacking, but Kenshin managed to block 2 consecutive strikes and then discarded his sword to block the final blow with his hands. Kenshin stated that at the moment Ayashi transitioned to offense, he was able to discern his movements and block the attack. Kenshin said he didn't need the title of the strongest and was willing to give it to Ayashi. All he wanted was to protect the people important to him. Kenshin then struck the handle of his sword straight into Ayashi's mouth. Despite being hit, Ayashi still managed to knock Kenshin away before fainting. This was because Kenshin's strike to his throat left him temporarily unable to breathe, causing him to pass out. When Ayashi regained consciousness, He asked Kenshin why he didn't finish him off. Kenshin explained that he was no longer a manslayer and had spared Ayashi's life. Kenshin then asked why Ayashi didn't accept an official position in the current era since his abilities must have earned him many offers. Ayashi admitted that he had indeed received many invitations, but they only wanted him, not his 4 subordinates. He had led his ninja team throughout the revolution, but now only 4 remained, with nowhere to return to. As their leader, he couldn't leave his subordinates stranded. At this moment, Taekta brought in the weapon he had prepared, a 6-barreled gun imported from America. He began firing, and Sano regained consciousness. Hanya also heard the commotion and decided to go with Shiki to join Sano and see what was happening. The short ninja and the flame-spewing ninja also heard the noise and decided to investigate. Taekta unleashed a barrage of bullets, deliberately firing wildly to force Ayashi and Kenshin to evade. He hit Ayashi's leg and then paused to reveal where he had acquired the weapon. He explained that he trafficked opium only as a stepping stone to fulfilling his ambition of dealing in weapons. He claimed that the skills Kenshin and Ayashi had taken decades to hone could now be surpassed by money, which gave him unrivaled power. At that moment, Sano and his group arrived. Kenshin followed Sano's advice to retreat to the other side, while Shiki charged forward to confront Taekta. Unsure whom to shoot, Taekta decided to aim at Ayashi. Shiki stepped in to shield his boss and took multiple bullets. As he collapsed, he was still glad that his body had been useful in protecting his leader. The flame-spewing ninja then arrived, threatening that if Taekta shot at him, the oil inside his body would explode. However, Taekta aimed elsewhere. The flame ninja was merely a distraction, allowing the short ninja to sneak up behind Taekta and aim a shot at him. But Taekta fired and deflected the bullet, taking out both ninjas. Hanya asked Kenshin how long he needed to retrieve his sword and attack Taekta. Kenshin replied that he needed 10 seconds. Hanya informed Kenshin that Megumi was upstairs and expressed his empathy for her situation, but he valued Ayashi more and couldn't help Megumi. Hanya then charged at Taekta to buy time for Kenshin. Hanya was ultimately shot and killed, but Kenshin managed to retrieve his sword. By this time, Taekta had run out of bullets. Kenshin struck Taekta, shattering his face. Sano noted that while Ayashi had pushed Kenshin to the brink, Ayashi's wounds were the most severe, not just external injuries, but also deep emotional scars. Kenshin asked Sano to give Ayashi some space. They then went to rescue Megumi. However, Megumi, overwhelmed by guilt, said her sins were too great and wanted to die to atone for them. Sano stopped her, saying that she was about to throw away all the effort the 3 of them had put in. Suddenly, the police arrived. Megumi handed Kenshin medicine to stop his bleeding and prepared to turn herself in. She went down to meet the police chief, and Taekta had already reported that she was the one who manufactured the opium. Kenshin intervened to stop her from confessing, telling the chief that Megumi had been captured by Taekta and forced to make the opium, but she had never willingly done so. The chief tentatively believed Kenshin, while Taekta began screaming about the injustice. Kenshin explained to Megumi that he had once been a manslayer, and his crimes were no less severe than hers. However, he had chosen to live and save others to atone for his sins. Moreover, Megumi's medical skills could save many lives, so it would be best for her to continue living to atone for the mistakes she had made. They then wondered where Ayashi was, but the police chief didn't know who that was since Ayashi hadn't been present when he broke in. Thus, they realized that Ayashi had escaped through a secret passageway that Taekta had installed. When they went to check the exit of the secret passage, it indeed had been opened. Soon after, they encountered Ayashi again. He had retrieved the heads of his fallen subordinates to give them a proper burial. Ayashi also declared that he would still target Kenshin in the future, but Kenshin said he was fully ready to face him again if they met. Kenshin then left after seeing Ayashi leave. The group returned to Kaoru's house to have breakfast, which she had painstakingly prepared despite injuring her hands in the process. Megumi asked to join them for the meal, and unsurprisingly, it was still terrible. Kaoru then apologized for not being able to let Megumi stay at her place, but informed her that she had found a new residence for her at the old doctor's house. Megumi teased Kenshin, saying that if he ever got tired of Kaoru, she would be ready to replace her as someone he could turn to. Hearing this, Kaoru regarded Megumi as a fox spirit and a romantic rival. Before leaving, Megumi spoke a few words to Sano. Kenshin then asked Sano if something was going on with Shiki because, when Kenshin had passed by Shiki earlier, Shiki mentioned that Sano had great potential and that Kenshin should treasure him. Kenshin wished he could have had the chance to talk more with them. In the days that followed, Kenshin heard that Yahiko was frequently absent. Sano joked that Yahiko was probably out chasing girls, while Kaoru thought he might be out snacking somewhere. Kenshin, however, believed Yahiko was training. Just then, Yahiko returned, simply saying he had been out for a walk. The others left, but Kenshin reminded Yahiko to keep up with his training. Yahiko claimed he was already training regularly and only took 2 days off per week. However, his behavior remained suspicious. The next day, Kenshin's group decided to follow him and discovered that he had gone to a beef hot pot restaurant. When they asked the waitress, they learned that Yahiko had started working there a few days ago. Sano assumed Yahiko had taken the job because of a girl, but the waitress clarified that the girl, Tsubame, had started working there after Yahiko, so it couldn't have been because of her. Yahiko had noticed Tsubame was timid and clumsy, so he wanted to help her improve. The group then stayed to eat and saw Tsubame being forced to serve a group of thuggish individuals. These men later dragged Tsubame outside, revealing that during the Bakumatsu, they had been the masters of Tsubame's family. They continued to coerce her into serving them even now, despite the new era. They demanded that Tsubame hand over a key mold from the shop so they could break in and steal. When she refused to aid in theft, they threatened to kill people to get what they wanted. At that moment, Yahiko arrived and decided to teach them a lesson. Yahiko could handle them individually as they lacked refined sword techniques. However, their numbers overwhelmed him, and he was eventually ganged up on. Kaoru wanted Kenshin to help Yahiko, but Kenshin believed that constantly saving Yahiko would prevent him from growing stronger. Unless Yahiko explicitly called for help, none of them would interfere in his fight. Tsubame was ultimately forced to hand over the key mold to the leader, who then spared Yahiko. Yahiko figured the group needed 1 day to create the key, so they would attack the next night. Tsubame apologized for dragging Yahiko into the situation, but he admitted he had gotten involved on his own accord, so she didn't need to apologize. Yahiko decided not to involve the police, fearing it would implicate Tsubame, and he also didn't want to seek help from Kenshin's group, he wanted to handle it himself. Yahiko then went home and built a training contraption to practice fighting against multiple opponents simultaneously. However, Kaoru pointed out that training in such a manner and actual combat were vastly different, and improving significantly within a single day would be challenging. Thus, Yahiko sought Kenshin's advice. Kenshin explained that the best way to deal with multiple opponents was to run and counterattack one at a time. Essentially, the key was to turn a group battle into a series of one-on-one encounters. Kaoru also taught Yahiko more about the philosophies of their school, and wanted him to commit them to memory. That evening, Tsubame's former masters began their theft operation. Yahiko sprang into action, snatching the key mold and luring the group into a narrow alley to isolate and take them on one by one. However, the leader quickly recognized Yahiko's strategy and ordered his subordinates to gang up on him. At that moment, Kenshin and Sano appeared on a nearby rooftop, intimidating the group into retreating. Yahiko, unaware of their intervention, only realized he was left to face the leader alone when Kenshin and Sano discreetly vanished from the scene. Now forced to fight with a real sword, Yahiko managed to read and evade his opponent's strikes. Though reluctant, he found himself silently thanking Kaoru for the knowledge and training she had provided him over time. Meanwhile, Kaoru approached Tsubame, advising her to stand up against her oppressors. She reassured Tsubame that if Yahiko won, she would finally be free. They then went to observe Yahiko's battle. As the leader aimed for Yahiko's legs, Yahiko quickly raised one leg, stepping onto the opponent's sword before countering with a decisive strike. Yahiko emerged victorious, liberating Tsubame from her former master's grip. Afterward, Kaoru escorted Tsubame home. Sano, curious, asked Yahiko why he had taken a job in the first place. Yahiko explained that he wanted to earn enough money to buy a reverse blade sword and pursue justice like Kenshin. Though the idea was laughable, Kenshin noted that such a sword was very expensive, meaning Yahiko would have to save for a long time. A few days later, Kaoru prepared to visit a dojo owned by an acquaintance to train. She invited Kenshin to join her, but he declined. To persuade him, Kaoru handed him a long shopping list, saying he'd have to take care of errands if he stayed behind. Begrudgingly, Kenshin agreed to accompany her. Around this time, two mysterious individuals arrived in town, investigating the strongest warriors and dojos in the area, including Kenshin. Upon reaching the dojo, Kaoru was warmly greeted by familiar faces, while the students were introduced to Kenshin for the first time. Kenshin met the dojo master, who initially intended to challenge him. However, upon seeing Kenshin's face, the master abandoned the idea, inviting Kenshin to relax instead. When Kaoru inquired about the aborted challenge, the master admitted he had already conceded defeat without a fight. Kaoru then began sparring with the students while the master engaged Kenshin in conversation. Kenshin commended the dojo as a good place, but the master revealed that it hadn't always been successful. At one point, it struggled to attract students, and he had used Kaoru's reputation to draw them in. He expressed guilt for exploiting the daughter of an old friend, but Kaoru bore no grudge, which eased his mind. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a man named Reijita, accompanied by his disciple, Yutaro. Reijita challenged the dojo master to a duel. Although disdainful of the use of bamboo swords, Reijita reluctantly agreed to follow the dojo's rules. The duel began, and Reijita swiftly struck the master's shoulder and neck, scoring a point. However, these blows fractured the master's shoulder blade, prompting calls to summon a doctor before the injury worsened. Despite this, the master insisted on continuing the match. In the next round, Reijita easily defeated him and was about to deliver a lethal blow when Kenshin intervened. Reijita declared that in his philosophy, defeat was synonymous with death. He lamented how swordsmanship had thrived during the Bakumatsu era but had waned in the peaceful Meiji period, overshadowed by technological advancements. Reijita then challenged Kenshin to a duel. Though Kenshin declined, Reijita threatened to burn down the dojo's signboard, prompting Kaoru to step forward. Kenshin intervened, volunteering to fight in her place. The duel commenced with wooden swords. Reijita attacked fiercely, forcing Kenshin to dodge repeatedly. Kenshin refrained from counterattacking, seeking only to end the match in a draw. However, just as Reijita unleashed a lethal strike, Kenshin noticed something and abruptly dropped his sword, stepping back. Reijita decided to give up and vowed to find Kenshin again another day, then walked off. Yahiko, on the other hand, decided he would beat Yutaro someday to teach him a lesson and get him to stop his rude behavior. At this point, Reijita realized that Kenshin was no ordinary swordsman. He was determined to challenge him again, knowing that Kenshin was a master swordsman from the Bakumatsu era. Kenshin, however, did not yet know who Reijita was, since even though Reijita had used a wooden sword, his strike had been powerful enough to split Kenshin's sword and leave a cut on the ground like a real blade. The group returned and told Sano about what had happened. Just then, an old butler arrived with an invitation for Kenshin to a duel. They decided to go and ended up at a large mansion, which belonged to Yutaro's family. Yutaro's father greeted them and led only Kenshin to meet Reijita, while the other three were entertained by Yutaro. According to Yutaro's father, they specialized in selling Japanese swords to Europeans, as Europeans considered Japanese swords to be valuable collector's items. A few months ago, their convoy had been attacked by thieves, and it was Reijita who had rescued them, which is why Yutaro followed him to learn from him. Kenshin soon met Reijita again, and Yutaro's 3 companions had tied him up, sneaking into the mansion to see how Kenshin would fare. Regida, now convinced that modern swordsmanship had become too weak and needed to be eradicated, aimed to rebuild his own sword style by eliminating all other weak techniques. He wanted only his style to thrive. Seeing Kenshin as the first strong opponent, Regida invited him to join him. Kenshin, however, declined. Though Kenshin regretted the decline of swordsmanship in these times, he didn't want to let styles created for killing survive. As Kenshin was about to leave, Regida drew his sword, stating that if Kenshin didn't understand his ambition, then Kenshin would become his enemy and must be eliminated. Regida then launched an attack, swinging with full force, causing trees to fall and rocks to split. However, when Kenshin drew his sword to retaliate, Regida's sword broke first. Kenshin explained that his sword symbolized his resolve to eliminate murderous intent. Upon hearing this, Regida left, promising to return for another duel in the future. The group left the mansion and freed Yutaro from his restraints. Yahiko, wanting Yutaro to stop complaining, suggested that if he wanted to show off, he could come to the dojo and fight him. That night, Yutaro came to challenge Yahiko, and although it was midnight, Yahiko agreed to fight. He soon realized that Yutaro didn't know how to properly handle a sword. They realized that Regida hadn't taught Yutaro anything, so Kaoru stepped in to teach him. She trained Yutaro until morning. Kenshin had made rice balls for everyone and asked Yutaro if he enjoyed the training. Yutaro admitted that he did. He wanted to master the sword to make his father realize his mistakes. Yutaro's father had abandoned his martial honor to pursue a career in business, even selling swords once the soul of the samurai to Westerners. Kenshin then invited Yutaro to come and learn swordsmanship at their dojo, so he could compete with Yahiko. That way, both would be motivated to improve. Yutaro later went to Regida to ask permission to study at Kaoru's dojo. Regida allowed it, under the guise of learning to understand the enemy, though secretly, he had his own agenda. In the days that followed, Kenshin told Sano that Yutaro came to the dojo every day to train and argue with Yahiko. Today, Kaoru had chosen Yahiko as the target for Yutaro to practice on. Yahiko put on a hat and let Yutaro strike a few times. Yahiko realized that Yutaro was indeed progressing quickly and was determined to learn. That night, they all went out for a beef hot pot to relax. Tsubame, curious about Yutaro, was told that he was a new friend of Yahiko's. Though they fought, Tsubame thought they were very close. Yutaro also seemed to believe he was superior to Yahiko in every way, including his treatment of women. Kaoru then asked Yutaro if he wanted to become her official student. Yutaro, though enjoying his time at the dojo, declined, saying that to become stronger, he needed to learn from Regida. That night, Yutaro took Kenshin and his group to the place where he first met Regida. At that time, they had been attacked by bandits, and Yutaro's father had bowed his head and begged the bandits, looking nothing like a member of a martial arts family. It was then that Regida appeared from behind, attacking the bandits and forcing them to flee. Since then, Yutaro had wanted to study under him to rebuild his family's martial arts legacy. At that moment, Regida appeared from behind again, trying to sneak attack Kenshin. Kenshin dodged, but Regida kept attacking, even using the environment by throwing dirt and rocks in a dirty move, only to have Kenshin land a blow to his head. Regida then changed his stance and unleashed a series of sword energy attacks at Kenshin. Kenshin dodged, but Yutaro was hit and injured on his arm. From the beginning, Regida had never intended to take Yutaro as his disciple. He was simply after Yutaro's family's money to revive his own swordsmanship. The bandit attack had been staged by him. Kenshin, furious, told Regida to stay where he was and wait for him, as he would return after taking Yutaro to the doctor. Sono remarked that Regida was a fool to provoke someone as terrifying as Kenshin. After taking Yutaro to Megumi, the doctor and her medical team explained that the tendons and nerves in Yutaro's right arm had been severed, leaving him unable to wield a sword anymore. Yahiko remarked that Yutaro had valued swordsmanship so much, and now it was all wasted. It was unfortunate, But that was life, one can't always have what they want. The doctor wasn't a miracle worker. Suddenly, Yahiko heard Yutero's voice from inside and ran to check. Yutero had woken up, shocked at the betrayal. Kenshin had already left, so Yahiko decided to show Yutero the outcome. Kaoru would also accompany them to keep an eye on both of them. Regida, seeing that Kenshin hadn't returned, assumed that Kenshin had run away. Sano, however, told Regida that he should leave before Kenshin returned, adding that he'd be happy to fight him if Regida wanted. But just then, Kenshin returned, and Sano had no choice but to step back. Kenshin was furious when he confronted Regida. He dodged all the sword energy attacks Regida threw at him and quickly realized the method behind Regida's attacks. While it was impossible for an average person to dodge such moves, for Kenshin, who could dodge bullets, it was not that difficult. Regida then unleashed a barrage of attacks, forcing Kenshin to keep dodging. Kenshin was slightly cut on his hand, and Regida, gleeful, thought he had finally defeated Kenshin. However, Kenshin realized that although Regida claimed his style was a killing sword technique, he had never actually killed anyone. Kenshin then vowed to show him what the killing sword of a demon truly looked like. Regida didn't like being mocked, so he continued to charge at Kenshin with powerful strikes, and when Kenshin jumped out of range, Regida followed up with sword energy attacks. Kenshin kept dodging but got another light injury to his leg. However, Kenshin was done with dodging. He was deliberately stalling for time until Kaoru's group arrived. When they did arrive, Kenshin finally began to counterattack. He stood in a defensive stance, threw his sword to strike Regida in the head, then rushed in to grab the sword and hit him with the hilt before finishing with a thrust to the head using the sword's scabbard. Yahiko then ran up, but Regida grabbed him and threatened to kill him. Everyone challenged him, knowing he didn't have the guts to kill. Kenshin explained that someone who wielded a killing sword needed the skill to bear the weight of killing with the sword. But Regida's technique was only for slashing, not killing. Kenshin threatened to show Regida the true meaning of a killing sword if he harmed Yahiko, and Regida, scared, released Yahiko. The group then went to call for Yutero to leave with them. In the following days, Yutero stayed hidden at home and did not come out to meet Yahiko's group. Kenshin later learned about Yutero's father's past. When the Meiji era arrived, swordsmanship had declined. Although he came from a martial arts family, Yutero's father couldn't make a living through it, so he turned to sword appraisal and trade, eventually becoming prosperous. But Yutero didn't want to live that way. His father planned to send Yutero to Germany for treatment and to live there, hoping that distance would make Yutero forget about swordsmanship. The day of departure arrived soon, and despite meeting with Yahiko's group one last time, Yutero didn't say a word. Yahiko, angry, rushed to attack, saying that he knew Yutero wasn't the type to be so despondent. If Yutero was hurt by the betrayal, he should just get stronger than Regida. The two argued, and Yutero vowed not to abandon swordsmanship, claiming that with just one hand, he could defeat Yahiko. Before leaving, Yahiko told Yutero to remember to come back because he wasn't done with him yet. Yutero then left, and Kenshin pondered over Regida. He admitted that Regida's swordsmanship was impressive and hoped that Regida would realize how lucky he was not to have crossed the line into murder. Kenshin was indeed concerned about the future of swordsmanship, but when he saw his two boys, his worries vanished. That night, Regida wanted to cross the line into killing and experience death, but in the end, he couldn't bring himself to harm anything other than a Buddha statue. Two old women had placed the head of the statue back in place, and Regida could only kneel and cry, realizing that he wasn't skilled enough to understand what it meant to wield a killing sword. Days passed, and Sano continued to regularly eat at the beef hot pot shop. One day, the waitress asked Sano to buy a few famous paintings to settle his debt. He went to buy the paintings and, during this visit, everyone noticed how different Sano was now. In the past, he had looked like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode and pick fights with anyone. But now, Sano had changed. He went to the shop to buy the paintings and ran into Kenshin and Kaoru. After a brief conversation about the paintings, Sano unexpectedly came across a painting of his old captain and asked who had painted it. Upon receiving the artist's name and address, Sano went to find the painter and learned that it was Hiro, an old comrade and friend from the past. Kenshin and Kaoru had followed him but decided to leave before intruding on Sano's personal matters. The reason Sano recognized Hiro was because the painting depicted both of them. Sano knew that Hiro had spent the last 10 years painting, but in reality, Hiro had been secretly planning to take revenge on the government, seeking to restore equality for the people and avenge their former captain's honor. Hiro then showed Sano a stash of bombs he had been accumulating over the past decade. Hiro planned to bomb the Ministry of the Interior that weekend to create chaos, then raise a rebellion to restore independence for the people. He didn't pressure Sano to join, leaving him to decide by the next day. When Sano left, Hiro sat and reflected on the old captain. The captain had greatly valued Hiro's sharpshooting skills but advised him to study and improve, as the age of guns and swords was coming to an end. The future was the age of knowledge, and if possible, Hiro should guide Sano toward that path. The next morning, Sano went to ask Kaoru's permission to host a party at her house. He wanted to invite Hiro and some friends to gather one last time. That afternoon, Hiro and everyone Sano knew arrived at the party. Two of Sano's gambling friends felt uneasy because Megumi was there, but Sano let it slide, and Megumi took the initiative to apologize for her past mistakes, which was accepted. They all then enjoyed the party and chatted with Hiro, who even drew portraits for a few of them. When it was Kenshin's turn, Hiro was somewhat uncomfortable because Kenshin had once been a political activist. But Sano gently reminded Hiro to let it go, so Hiro continued drawing. However, he only drew Kenshin's face and the scar, leaving out his eyes, nose, and mouth. That night, after everyone had eaten and returned home, and a few stayed at Kaoru's house, Sano and Hiro knew it was time to leave. The party was a final thank you to everyone because after this, Sano would be a fugitive and might be dealt with by Kenshin's reverse sword. But Sano didn't blame anyone, as this was his own decision. Kenshin overheard everything and opened his eyes just as Sano left. Sano and Hiro then went to the Ministry of the Interior, where they began throwing bombs to start a fire and lure the guards to the front gate. The two then ran along the wall to climb inside. However, as soon as they entered, both came face to face with Kenshin. Hiro now realized that he was facing the legendary Batusai. But Kenshin didn't come to bring Sano back. He came to stop them because he respected Sano's decision. Hiro then threw bombs at Kenshin, but Kenshin easily sliced through their fuses. However, one bomb did explode, though Kenshin dodged it. Sano tried to stop Hiro, telling him this wouldn't lead to a victory, but Hiro refused to abandon his efforts of 10 years. This forced Sano to knock Hiro out and take him away. Kenshin had already prepared an escape route for them. Sano then asked Kenshin if, should he continue to help Hiro, Kenshin would be ready to take action against him. Kenshin promised that he would stop Sano if it came to that, which put Sano's mind at ease. Hiro later woke up at home, only to find the bombs had disappeared. Sano told him that Kenshin had taken them and destroyed them. But Hiro thought Sano had colluded with Kenshin to prevent him from starting the rebellion. So, Hiro decided to take another approach, to commit seppuku in front of the people, exposing the government's crimes. Before Sano could stop him, Hiro used a smoke bomb to escape. Sano had to find him, as Kenshin had entrusted him with this task. Later, when Sano heard the police sirens, he pinpointed Hiro's location and pushed him into the river. The two decided to fight there. Hiro accused Sano of betraying him, but he had never revealed their plan to Kenshin. Kenshin had simply meddled in their affairs. Hiro felt wronged and wanted to reclaim the 10 years he had lost for his plan. Hiro threatened Sano with a knife, but then decided to fight him with bare hands. Hiro was confident because Sano had never beaten him before, but Sano was different now and managed to knock Hiro down. However, Hiro got back up, tackled Sano, and began punching him relentlessly. Hiro argued that for 10 years he had endured suffering and tried to redeem their captain's honor, while Sano had only fought and befriended a former revolutionary like Kenshin. But Sano stood up and declared that Hiro's actions were meaningless because even if the government was rotten, there were still people working hard to rebuild the kind of society their captain had hoped for. From Kaoru, who struggled to restore her family's swordsmanship, to Yahiko, a boy abandoned by society, but who still trained diligently, to Megumi, who was once forced into illegal work, but now saved many lives as a doctor. What Hiro did was pointless because 10 years had already passed. Sano then took Hiro back and told him that Kenshin didn't care for the current government either. That's why he had tried to stop its consequences, because he had played a role in creating it. If they followed the path of deceit and used any means to achieve their goals, they would truly be no better than the false accusations their captain had faced. What they needed to do was prioritize the people's wishes. And now, the people were content with the present, so they didn't need to change anything. Kenshin later lit a flare and threw it up to signal that he had handled everything. A few days later, Hiro decided to listen to their old captain, that he should fight in his own way. Hiro decided he would continue to resist the government, but through his paintings. Sano, now with Kenshin, went to visit the painting shop owner, who told them that Hiro had asked him to give this painting to Sano, a painting of their old captain. Hiro would now paint for the purpose of creating political commentary, not to sell his works as he had before. The shop owner was saddened to lose such a lucrative source of income. One day, Kenshin fell asleep and was woken by Kaoru and Yahiko after her training session had finished. The two dragged Kenshin home, asking him what he had been dreaming about. He told them that he had dreamed about a team of elite samurai from the past, who could be considered the special forces of the shogunate. Back then, most samurai acted alone, so this elite team was created to eliminate those lone samurai. Kenshin considered them his greatest enemies because the commanders of these teams were formidable. Unfortunately, most of the commanders of that elite force had died in battle by now. Kaoru noticed that Kenshin had not talked so much about his past in a long time. It had been ages since he had dreamed of the Bakumatsu era, and now this dream seemed to signal something unusual. Kenshin himself felt something strange within him. He stood there, deep in thought. Meanwhile, back at home, Sano encountered a man who introduced himself as a medicine trader looking for the homeowner. However, Sano found it suspicious that a medicine trader would have calloused hands, clearly from wielding a sword. Immediately, the man stepped back, realizing that Barusai wasn't home. Sano also recognized that anyone familiar with Kenshin was no ordinary person. He decided to engage the man in a fight. Despite taking Sano's full punch, the opponent showed no signs of faltering and charged at Sano with a sword. At the same time, Kenshin, still lost in thought, walked slowly, worrying everyone around him. Along the way, they ran into Megumi, who mentioned she had 2 days off and decided to visit Kaoru. Noticing that Kenshin looked unwell, Megumi offered to examine him, but Kenshin reassured her that he was fine. He resolved to stop dwelling on his dream to avoid causing concern. However, when they arrived home, they smelled blood and found Sano severely injured, with half a sword embedded in his shoulder. The attacker was revealed to be Sato, the former captain of the 3rd Division of the Shogunate's elite forces. Sato was meeting with the person who had previously hired Kurosaga. This man was now targeting Kenshin and had hired Sato to take care of him. Sato accepted the job, as it gave him an opportunity to confront his eternal rival. The employer revealed that Sato was the strongest member of the elite forces and suggested that if Kurosaga had failed to defeat Kenshin, Sato would surely succeed. Meanwhile, Megumi worked tirelessly to treat Sano's injuries, and Kenshin began to piece together who had attacked him. 3 days later, Sano remained unconscious, and Kenshin sat in contemplation. He deduced that the culprit was Sato, his old rival. Kenshin realized Sato had lost none of his strength over the years, and he doubted whether his current ideals would allow him to defeat Sato. Elsewhere, Sato met with a man named Akamatsu, the strongest subordinate of their employer. Akamatsu was displeased with Sato for taking over his prey, prompting Sato to devise a plan. Knowing Kenshin had become aware of his presence, Sato sent a letter inviting Kenshin to meet, planning for Akamatsu to fight Kenshin first. Akamatsu agreed and left, unaware that Sato intended to use him as a pawn. Kenshin received the letter and prepared to leave. He instructed Yahiko to lock the door as he would be back late that night. At the meeting place, Kenshin encountered Akamatsu, who attacked him immediately. Kenshin was forced to defend himself, cutting the chains Akamatsu swung at him. Akamatsu feigned surrender, claiming he was only following Sato's orders. When Kenshin turned to leave, Akamatsu sprang into action, throwing 2 chains to bind Kenshin's hands and neck. Kenshin blocked the chains from strangling him with his arms, but his hands were now restrained, allowing Akamatsu to throw him around violently. Meanwhile, Yahiko returned home with groceries and told Kaoru that Kenshin had mentioned he would be late. Yahiko joked that Kenshin might be out with a woman, given that he'd been in town for months and must have noticed someone. Suddenly, Sato arrived at their home, introducing himself as Fujita, a subordinate of the police chief. He claimed to have come to warn Kenshin about someone targeting him. Since Kenshin was out, Sato decided to wait for him. Kaoru speculated that the person targeting Kenshin was likely the one who had injured Sano. Megumi reassured them that Kenshin could handle himself, so there was no need to panic or go looking for him. Back at the fight, Kenshin was still being thrown around by Akamatsu. Akamatsu revealed that he, Kurosaga, and Sato were all hired by the government to kill Kenshin. The government feared someone might expose the dark deeds of the past and wanted Kenshin eliminated to keep them hidden. Kenshin deduced that Sato was a man who had purged many rogue samurai in the past. Realizing that Sato still continued these actions in the present, Kenshin resolved that he would have to stop him. Kenshin grabbed the chain, locked it in place, and drew his sword with his mouth, charging forward. That night, when Kenshin returned home, Kaoru informed him about someone targeting him. She told him about Fujita, and upon meeting him again, Kenshin immediately recognized him as Sato, the assassin. The two had crossed paths 10 years ago. Kenshin respected Sato as a worthy opponent back then because he never relied on dirty tricks, always facing his enemies directly. However, Kenshin was disappointed to see him now using underhanded tactics, like using Akamatsu as bait. Sato dismissed Kenshin's accusations as delusional, explaining that Akamatsu was merely a means to test whether Kenshin's strength was still intact. Sato concluded that Kenshin's once deadly swordsmanship had dulled. Kenshin clarified that he now only needed the strength of a wanderer, enough to protect the people important to him. He had no use for the strength of a killer, which only served to take lives. Sato scoffed at this, calling Kenshin naive. He argued that Kenshin's so-called protective strength was useless, as Sato could have killed everyone in the house during Kenshin's fight with Akamatsu. Not just him, any of Kenshin's former enemies had the opportunity to harm the people he cherished. Furthermore, Kenshin had failed to prevent his enemies from causing severe harm, like the incident that left a young boy permanently paralyzed. Kaoru realized Sato had been observing Kenshin for a long time. She also understood Sato's point. Kenshin had grown weaker over the past 10 years, foolishly believing he could protect others without killing. Despite this, Kenshin remained firm in his resolve never to kill again. Sato, unconvinced, drew his sword and challenged Kenshin, giving him a choice: fight him and kill him, or watch him eliminate everyone in the house. Kenshin stepped forward, ignoring Kaoru's attempts to stop him, reasoning that since he was the target, it was best to confront Sato directly. Sato lunged, and Kenshin dodged, attempting to counter with a blow. However, Sato redirected his attack and struck Kenshin, sending him flying. Sato revealed that he had refined his techniques to be lethal in any battle, believing that honing ordinary skills to their absolute peak was the best way to create deadly attacks. When Sato charged again, Kenshin tried to disarm him by breaking his weapon, but Sato countered. His sword, a companion of 10 years, was not so easily broken. Kaoru intervened to stop the fight, but Kenshin pushed her aside. Sato noticed a change in Kenshin. After observing his fights with previous enemies, Sato realized that during combat, Kenshin unconsciously reverted to his Badusai persona, and he was even stronger than before. When Sato attacked, Kenshin dodged by slipping underneath him and counterattacked with such speed that Sato barely managed to kick Kenshin away in time. Sato was shocked by Kenshin's speed, wondering whether he had fully reverted to Badusai or was merely in a heightened state of focus. To find out, Sato resolved to fight seriously. Sato charged again, but Kenshin sidestepped, anticipating Sato's next move, and struck the back of Sato's neck. The force of the blow sent Sato flying out of the dojo. Kenshin demanded that Sato get up and continue fighting. Kaoru, distressed, didn't know how to stop the fight, fearing that Kenshin would completely revert to the Badosai of 10 years ago. She called out to them to stop, but Kenshin shattered Sato's sword. Sano observed that both men's minds had returned to the battlefield of a decade ago, concluding that only someone from that era could intervene. Meanwhile, a man searching for Sato discovered that he had been at Kaoru's dojo for 4 hours and suspected something was amiss. Kenshin urged Sato to give up and leave, but Sato, bound by the honor of a samurai, refused to flee a fight. Charging once more, Sato attempted to finish the battle, but Kenshin threw his sword aside and maneuvered behind Sato to deliver a decisive blow. Sato, however, deflected Kenshin's arm using his belt. He then wrapped his jacket around Kenshin's neck in an attempt to choke him, but Kenshin ducked and struck Sato's chin with the sheath of his sword. Both Kenshin and Sato were utterly exhausted, and their next blows would determine the outcome. Kaoru tried to intervene, but she was too late. At that moment, a man arrived just in time to stop Kenshin and Sato. This man was a former revolutionary, now the Minister of Internal Affairs in the government. He was one of the 3 most instrumental figures in the revolution and arguably the most powerful man in the country. The minister questioned Sato about his mission, as Sato had only been tasked with assessing Kenshin's strength. Sato reported that Kenshin himself was useless, but Badosai could still be utilized. The minister then expressed his desire for Kenshin to join him, but Kenshin refused. To regain control of himself, Kenshin struck his own head, forcing the Badosai persona to retreat. The minister, realizing there was much to discuss, waited until Kenshin's wounds were fully treated and everyone had gathered. He revealed troubling news about a man named Shio, who was secretly mobilizing once more. Shio was a figure from 10 years ago. When Kenshin abandoned the title of Badosai, Shio was chosen as his successor, the new Badosai. However, Kenshin had never met him, only hearing rumors of Shio's death during the revolution. Kenshin recalled that Shio had been eliminated by his own allies. The minister disclosed the truth. Shio was indeed as powerful as Kenshin, but far more ambitious and cold-blooded. To prevent future calamities, the government had attempted to eliminate Shio by burning him alive. Despite their efforts, Shio survived and was now rallying an army to overthrow the government. Numerous attempts to stop him had failed, and now the government pinned its hopes on Kenshin. They offered him a handsome reward and amnesty for past offenses, such as pardoning Megumi's involvement in drug trafficking. However, Megumi was adamant, declaring she would rather face execution than be used as a bargaining chip to coerce Kenshin. Sono was outraged, blaming the government's cowardly actions for creating this problem in the first place and now expecting Kenshin to clean up their mess. The minister's subordinate argued that the government was under threat, but Sano retorted that a corrupt government like theirs didn't deserve to exist. Yahiko pointed out that if Kenshin worked for them, he might end up like Shio, another pawn consumed by the system. Everyone opposed Kenshin taking on this task, and the minister gave him a week to decide. Meanwhile, Sato hunted down Akamatsu, who was trying to flee, and eliminated him. He also planned to deal with the person who hired him, as he now felt obligated to serve the nation to atone for the wrongs committed by the previous shogunate. Nevertheless, Sato vowed to uphold his ideal of eradicating those who endangered the country, even if they were government officials like the minister himself. As a former commander of the shogunate forces, he insisted that no one could control him. Days later, Sano approached Kenshin, asking about his decision. Sano urged Kenshin to walk away from the matter, citing his disdain for government officials. However, Kenshin believed in the minister's integrity, reasoning that if he were corrupt, Sato would have already dealt with him. Kenshin explained Sato's ideal of justice, a man driven by his principles, free from external control. Kenshin decided to meet the minister directly, reasoning that the minister must be busy and shouldn't be inconvenienced. Everyone assumed Kenshin intended to decline the request. Meanwhile, as the minister traveled, a swordsman intercepted him, mocking him for foolishly entrusting Kenshin with the task of dealing with Shio. Shortly after, a group of swordsmen appeared, also intent on assassinating the minister. Upon realizing someone else had already struck him down, they proceeded to slash at the body to leave evidence implicating themselves. When the minister's body was later discovered, people assumed he had been killed by swordsmen from another province, unaware of Shio's faction's involvement. The assassin crossed paths with Kenshin, warning him not to oppose Shio. Kenshin returned to inform Sato and the minister's subordinate of what had transpired. They summoned someone the minister had met earlier that morning, a person who had spoken at length about the minister's noble ideals. The minister had been planning a 30-year reform to gradually transform Japan from a feudal nation into a democratic one, where the people would have the right to determine their own paths. With the death of the minister, the most trustworthy figure in the country Japan was now plunged into uncertainty and chaos. Shio would not miss this opportunity. He would rise to seize control of the nation. The balance of the era was beginning to shift once more. That evening, Kenshin returned and announced that he could not allow Shio to continue unchecked and would go after him to resolve the matter. Kenshin admitted that he could never completely abandon his Badosai nature. When he fought Kurosaga, he transformed into Badosai solely to save Kaoru, and it was her voice that brought him back to himself. However, during his fight with Sato, the thrill of battle had overtaken him, and he could no longer hear her voice. Kenshin expressed his gratitude to Kaoru for letting him stay all this time, but he now realized there were still many who hated and targeted him. Even as Kenshin, they would always see him as Badosai. To avoid dragging everyone else into his conflicts, he decided he could no longer stay. Kenshin resumed his wandering path as a lone swordsman and gradually disappeared into the depths of the night. Thus concludes the first part of Rurouni Kenshin. This is a remake of the story, so those who wish to continue following the narrative may refer to the original version. For now, farewell.